conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. Let me tell you who's on our panel tonight. If you're watching on Global Player, you will see that we have one space empty, but he is on his way. Peter Tatchell is on his way to the studio, at least we hope he is. Janet Daley is to my left, columnist for the Sunday Telegraph. Stephen Pound, former Labour MP and Shadow Northern Ireland Minister, to my right. And Tony Devenish, Conservative London Assembly Member and Deputy Chair of the Environment Committee at City Hall. We've been spending the last hour talking about the ULEZ zone. I suspect that might come up, but lots of other things that you can phone in about as well. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. If any of you read my column in the Telegraph yesterday about the possible return of Boris Johnson, you might like to ask our panel a question on that. I'm sure Janet has some views. I definitely know that Stephen does, and Tony will probably want to give a very short answer to that one. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text 84850. You can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC to submit your question. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, well, let's kick off with Dave in Harrow. Hello, Dave.
Hi, Ian. My question would be to the panel, how should Sadiq Khan respond to the four Labour MPs, I think, who are opposing the expansion of his ULEZ scheme?
This is a story from our reporter Henry Riley, who spoke to four Labour MPs who think that the ULEZ, or the introduction or the expansion of the ULEZ zone, should be delayed for a year. It's coming in on the 29th of August. We've had some amazing calls in the last hour on this. People on both sides of the argument really passionately putting forward their point of view. And it's quite difficult to really say, well, I'm categorically on one side or the other here. You listen to parents who are really concerned about their children's health, and then you listen to our last caller there, who won't be able to visit his 91-year-old mother to care for her if he has to scrap his car. Tony Devenish, this has obviously developed into a bit of a party political spat, but I mean, ULEZ zones in theory aren't bad things, are they?
They're not, and the one in central London was initiated by Boris Johnson and he was mayor. It was brought in by Sadiq, and it works in central London. But outer London is bigger, it's very, very different, and the reality is the Jacobs report, which is a TfL, Transport for London report, which is Sadiq's own report on this, said one thing: there is no change, virtually nothing at all, to air quality. This is not about air quality. I'm very for better air quality. And for example, Heathrow at the moment are looking at reopening the third runway. That would be a big issue on air quality. And when Sean Bailey was the Tory candidate for mayor, he had a very good policy for air quality: have more electric buses. This is not an air quality issue. This is a stealth tax. That's all it is, a stealth tax. Sadiq has put council tax up by 57% in 7 years. This is yet another tax, as is the congestion charge and many, many other things. Khan needs to listen. The gentleman asked what should he actually do with these four Labour MPs. He should listen to his parliamentary colleagues. He should listen to the Labour borough leader, who's also come against this. He should listen to Londoners. 80% of Londoners in his own public consultation said no to this. There is no legitimate mandate. If he wants to bring it in, he can bring it in at the next mayoral election in his manifesto and try and get elected.
But if you want to reduce quality, obviously one way of doing it is getting more cars off the road. The other one is surely to make sure that they're not on the road for as long as they need to be, which means reducing congestion. But then I don't think this is Sadiq Khan, I think this is the boroughs. They're introducing these local traffic networks, is that what they're called?
LTNs. Yes, indeed.
You think they're an excellent idea. Well, many people do not. And you look at some of the transport planning that Transport for London do, where they deliberately make people drive for longer. And you think, well, what is the point of that?
Iain, you're right. Look, my transport expert, when I first became a Westminster councillor, said very simple: water is like transport. If you push water, it goes in a different direction. And that's what transport engineers do. And the reality is LTNs, having cycle highways on main roads, having more bus lanes. Sadiq is is very keen because he knows the only voters for him are the Labour-Green coalition. That 30% of people that will turn out in local elections, more than for any other party, and get him re-elected. But it's very much a middle-class architect.
All right, Stephen Pound.
I think it trivialises it, in all honesty, and to actually talk about it in terms of it being a potential earner for City Hall.
Well, it will be.
It's much no, because the money will be ring-fenced, because it'll be obviously contained within the budget. But it's a very, very significant issue we have in London. I think the problem, when you have people like Seema Malhotra and John Cruddas and Siobhan McDonough, real loyalists, when they're saying there's an issue, then quite clearly we need to talk about it. I think where SEDEC does have a problem is that some of the data is big. For example, the outer borough data for Bromley, saying that they've got a higher death rate in Bromley. Well, they actually have a much older population in Bromley. And also that the higher and the lower quartiles in some of the data was specifically chosen so that the upper quartile was there. But I think ultimately the thing about LTNs and the thing about ULEZ is it's not about driving people around in circles. It's about alternative ways of getting around. Now, my son's an electrician. He moves around in a van. He could not take his kit on the E2 bus. We know that. So I'm very much in favour of the idea of actually bringing this in much more slowly and actually also having a
So you think it should be delayed?
Yeah, I'm afraid I do, because August is just round the corner. But we have a mayoral election, I think, is it next year?
Yeah, May.
In May of... No, it's carved on your heart, is it?
It certainly is.
So, I think perhaps we can talk about it, but for the moment, ever since the death of Kissy, ever since we've had this issue of the air quality in London...
and my mother phoned in half an hour ago.
That's why I remember you were speaking to her a long, long time ago. But I remember when George Young was Transport Minister and we had all the business, what we called Leadville, the A40, where people's brains were being infected by the lead in petrol. We damn well got rid of it. People at the time said, oh, you take lead out of petrol, I won't be able to ride my Triumph 650 motorcycle. But we did it. We got rid of it. And I think ultimately, if you look at London in 10 years' time, we will not have all these cars driving around in the centre with internal combustion engines pumping out noxious gases.
OK, Janet?
The reason that so many Labour MPs objected to this so strenuously is because it hits the poorest and most disadvantaged, the elderly who can't afford to replace their cars, tradesmen, for example. It's very difficult to get a tradesman in London now, simply because it's impossible for them to park anywhere. If they have to pay additional charges to come in to outer London will be in the same plight as inner London. And we're talking here about an extension, not an introduction. And the extension is going to be to boroughs which are semi-rural. I live in a London borough which is on the edge of the green belt and has extremely clean air. It would be absurd.
How do you know that? Because a lot of the boroughs don't even measure their air quality. No,
apparently mine does. Okay. Where we live was once described as a country town on the edge of London, rather picturesquely. The point is, it's absurd.
I'm guessing Richmond.
No, it's not.
That's Southall.
North London.
Okay.
North London. I won't
No.
just for this. The point is, this is an extension of something that has a kind of logic in the innermost boroughs of London, particularly all those terrible figures about child asthma and brains being affected was very much to do with the traffic on very heavily travelled bits of the North Circular, for example, which go through sort of Brent, which go through very heavily congested areas. But the idea of extending this out to places that are in home counties where there is really no serious risk to health. This is nothing but, I'm sorry, Stephen, a cash grab. And it's because Sadiq Khan has managed to get London into a terrible position in terms of deficit, and he needs to find ways of raising revenue.
The pandemic helped on that, didn't it?
Of course. But he also made huge contributions to London Transport pension funds and increases to pension funds, and he's now got himself into a position where he must find ways of raising money, and this looks like a very virtuous, presentable, sellable policy to raise money. But it's going to make life impossible for tradesmen, for example, who very often drive diesel vans, people who have cars that they cannot afford to replace, and the business that Stephen was suggesting about replacing the private car altogether. I would defy you, Stephen, to go on a shopping trip, to get a week's shopping at a supermarket with a couple of small children in tow. Or if you've got any kind of temporary or permanent infirmity, say you're 8 months pregnant, or you're arthritic, or you've got, back problems. There are all kinds of people for whom public transport is not a reasonable solution, who
Electric
need private
Ocado
cars.
is the answer.
Sorry?
Electric Ocado.
How very middle class.
I know,
Yes.
I'm from Ealing, mate.
This is Sadiq Khan's poll tax moment. Mark
Exactly.
my words. And that was from a Labour MP privately to me.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, this is obviously going to play a big part in the election campaign. It seems as though only a year ago that we had the last one. Is this a shorter term or something?
We had an extra year because of COVID, so the 4-year term became 5 years, so this one's only a 3-year term. So yes, but Khan would have done 8 years still at the end of this term. Please vote to get rid of Sadiq Khan.
Peter Tatchell, welcome.
Train delays, what can I say?
Cow on the line at Basingstoke.
Thank heavens I had my bike with me.
We are talking about the ULEZ zone. The caller, Dave in Harrow, says, how should Sadiq Khan respond to the 4 Labour MPs saying the ULEZ extension should now be delayed? Do you think it should be delayed?
No, I don't. I can understand why people want it delayed, but the crisis in public health, in particular the effect on young people's lungs and health, is so severe, we've got to do something. We have to act. And I'm really sorry, but people are going to get some compensation in order to switch vehicles.
£2,000, that's not going to touch the sides, is it?
But Peter, it doesn't work. This is not about air quality.
It's going to help.
And we're talking about Kent. We're talking about home counties. We're talking about places where there is not heavy congestion and heavy pollution.
Sadiq Khan's
hang on, Peter has only just arrived. You don't all need to gang up on him. Let him have his say.
I'm sitting in respectful silence, because I agree with
for once.
Look, there are lots of places outside of London where there is severe congestion. I was recently in Barnet, which is way out of central London, and the traffic there is very heavy. And when I got out of the train station, I could smell immediately the car fumes. And I was thinking to myself, I'm going to school to speak. These school kids have to walk through this every day to get to school. Look at the damage it's doing in terms of asthma and other
I think I spoke at the same school as you the week after.
Henrietta Barnet.
Yeah, I think it was, actually. Yeah.
That's what they advertised, anyway.
Right. We are going to move on in just a second. Let Peter gather his breath. You're listening to LBC. If you want to give us a call and ask a question, we have one space free, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:15.
LBC.
18 minutes past 8. Stephen Pound wished me happy Valentine's Day as he walked in the studio.
Little knowing he was
and
diabetic.
gave me a box of chocolates. Isn't that nice? Yeah, I'm diabetic, so you basically want to kill me. Peter Tatchell is here with us, Janet Daley from the Telegraph, Stephen Pound, former Labour MP, and Tony Devenish, Conservative London Assembly member. Let's go to another caller. It's Jake in Orpington. Hello, Jake.
Hello. Yeah, I just want to ask a question. With the thought of Boris Johnson coming back into the realm of being, I don't know, in Parliament with his, I don't know, his integrity, his honesty, and his, I don't know, implications with...
So you're not a fan. Right, Jake, thank you very much for that. Now, I was a bit naughty, Janet. I know you can be naughty in the Telegraph as well, but I was yesterday where I wrote an article, not saying that Boris Johnson should come back, but saying, well, this is the pathway where he could come back. And I mean, I could explain it all now, but if the local elections go really badly, say he has a couple of high-profile resignations, if Tory MPs get the jitters, it has been known, let's face it, and they get rid of him, well, who would they replace Rishi Sunak with? I would have thought Boris Johnson was an obvious candidate. Stephen Pound, you were in Parliament for a long time, saw all the comings and goings in the Tory party. What do you think
I
would
thought
happen?
Boris, when he was, we used to call him the Henley Regretter, when he was the MP for Daley. In fact, I'll be in Uxbridge and Ruislip on Saturday. Look, I thought your piece was very, very good and very prescient, but I remember a very distinguished person who was once the Conservative candidate in North Norfolk saying to me, there's no second acts in politics. And I just genuinely don't. I'm sure there must you can probably come up with an example somewhere.
Alan Clark.
But, okay, I think Alan Clark, he kind of ripped up the rule book, didn't he? But, by and large, there aren't. I think the thing is that, that is a brand which is no longer viable. I think the thing with Boris is that what he does have, and, that gives me absolutely no pleasure whatsoever to say this, but, he does actually seem to actually find, that the nation's pulse quite easily. I've seen him on the street, and he's quite extraordinary when he comes, absolutely amazing. But it's actually about celebrity. It's not about politics. It's not about policy. And it's certainly not about rescuing the Conservative Party. I mean, the obvious person to take over would be Jeremy Hunt, the one person we really fear in the Labour Party.
Really?
Oh, absolutely, because he's got calm, intelligence, competence, and the trouble is he's probably going to lose his seat.
But so might Boris Johnson. The thing is,
he will.
If you're a Conservative MP and you have a sort of middling majority, say between 5,000 and 10,000, and you think you're a goner under the current regime, would you not be tempted to vote for somebody who could mitigate the scale of defeat? I think that would be the question that a lot of Tory MPs will be asking themselves in those circumstances.
Tory MPs just don't think like that. They just don't think about damage limitation. What they think about, is Lee Anderson going to save us? And, if he's the answer, then it's a damn stupid question.
Janet?
The question is, can he save them? I don't think he can. And I mean, I'm speaking anecdotally here. I know a lot of people who were lifetime Conservative voters who say they would not vote Conservative again if he was leading the party. I'm sorry to say that. I've known Boris for 20 years. We were colleagues on the Telegraph, and he is charismatic and funny. Can I say this word on broadcast?
I don't know what you're going to say.
My next door neighbour, when he went, so I'm going to say it, I said, he's charismatic, he's funny, and he's an asshole. And that's pretty much.
I do apologise to anyone.
I apologise, but it was so perfect. It was so perfect.
If anybody on this panel was going to say a rude word, I would not have thought
Absolutely.
it would be.
No, you don't know me very well. But the difficulty, I think, the insurmountable difficulty is what happened during lockdown, the lockdown Partygate. There are terrible things happened during lockdown. People died alone without their families with them. Grandparents died without seeing their newborn grandchildren. Terrible, terrible things. And the glimpse of him at those parties and what came out about what was going on at Downing Street, I think that is insurmountable. I don't think that he can recover. I think he's tremendously intelligent. He's not terribly good on detailed policy, but very good at projecting a political message. But I think that remains a kind of curse that he cannot recover from.
Okay, Peter Tatchell.
I think it's all hypothetical, because if he did stand again in Uxbridge, it looks like he's going to lose. Now,
he could do the chicken run.
They'll find him a safe seat.
It is rumoured that he's been seen recently in Oxfordshire looking at local schools, and he
was seen in Tunbridge Wells, where I live, looking at a house.
Yeah, well, maybe he is on the chicken run to find a safe seat. in that case, the question would be, would he win? And if he got a safe seat, probably he might just scrape through. But the question would then be, what would the Tories want? And if they ditched Rishi Sunak, there is a very sizable proportion of grassroots Tories who do want Boris back. They may not have the sense and acumen that we have in terms of his abilities and his integrity, but clearly some of them, or a lot of them, think that he's the one who can save the Tory party.
Tony Devenish, do you?
Look, the reality is I've knocked on doors in 14 target seats in the last 3.5 months, 100+ days since Rishi took over. This is a wonderful Westminster Village discussion, Ian. You wrote great articles. I'm old enough to remember when people like you wrote articles saying Mrs Thatcher was going to come back under John Major. The reality is...
No, I
Rishi Sunak,
didn't do that, to be fair.
No, you're not that old, though.
I am.
But Rishi Sunak is Prime Minister. And actually, you know what I do find on the doorstep and what all the opinion polls showing? Yes, my party are 20% behind in the polls at the moment, but actually nearly 30% of people in key target seats haven't decided. They don't particularly like Keir Starmer. What's there to like? They haven't decided about Rishi, but they're giving him the benefit of the doubt. And we've got 2 years nearly until the general election. Boris is having a great retirement. I wish him well as a backbench MP.
That is interesting. Obviously, you're sort of coming to the defence of your leader. I understand that. But he hasn't shifted the polls in his first 3 months in office. Now, you might say, well, I never thought he would. But how long do you give him? Because there is only, well, say, 18 months until the next election. And that is quite a short time to turn things around, or yeah. that amount of percentage opinion polling.
The PM has made it very clear. That's why there's the 5 pledges. He has got to deliver, deliver and deliver. You know, I know him well. I've got an awful lot of respect for him. I think if anybody can turn it around, he can. But the British people decide, not the people on this panel. The British people will decide at the general election.
OK, let's move on. Jake, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's go to Stephen in East Grinstead. Stephen, hello. What would you like to ask?
Hi, good evening to you, Ian, and your guests. Should we really be surprised about nations spying on each other? And have we as individuals allowed ourselves to be spied on by various items of technology and technology companies?
You can tell when Parliament's not sitting, can't you? Because a story becomes a massive story when a lot of people think, I mean, we're talking about the Chinese weather balloons here. And I suppose it's because we haven't ever thought of weather balloons as sort of mechanisms of spying. Should we be surprised by this, Stephen Pound?
I think we shouldn't really be surprised. You mentioned earlier on that if you want to listen to this programme, you say to Alexa, you know, phone Iain Dale. Well, Alexa probably thinking to herself, well, he did that last week. You know, what's he going to do next week? There's information all over the place, baby. But I always thought the Chinese balloons that were a menace were those fire balloons that went flying around by Heathrow Airport. But I mean, I think that what are the Chinese actually after from us? I don't know if you've been watching this warship programme.
No.
On the it's about the big Lizzie, the battleship Queen Elizabeth. The aircraft carrier, Queen Elizabeth. And, you know, when she goes into the South China Sea, she's surrounded by Chinese frigates and Chinese warships, desperate to try to find out what exactly is it? What are these great secrets that we've got?
Well, you don't know until you discover them.
Well, exactly, but that's a sort of interesting philosophical question. Sort of Schrodinger's cat. But I don't think we should be too terrified about the Chinese things, but it's interesting that Joe Biden is now sort of beating his chest and saying, I've just shot down a Chinese weather balloon. Well, you know, the NATO and the Western Alliance is safe.
Well, Rishi Sunak saying he would do exactly the same.
Of course he would. So it's a win-win,
but apparently, we don't know whether these things fly over our skies. Which, when you think about the technological advances, and you think, well, surely there are systems that you can tell where these things are. Apparently not. Janet Daley.
China, this is not a Cold War like it was with the Soviet Union. We're not at risk of war with China unless somebody makes a mistake. This is probably technological surveillance. What they want to do is not convert the world to communism or defeat the West militarily. They want to buy it up. And the idea is to, they're terribly good at stealing intellectual property. And I think that's what this is really about. They're spying to find technological information so that they can remain dominant in that field. And that's what it's all about. This is a very different kind of espionage from the kind we were accustomed to during the Cold War with the Soviet Union.
Peter?
all nations, all great nations, spy. Britain spies, the United States spies, all the European countries, they spy. Spying is part of the stock in trade of modern nations.
And allies spy on allies.
Exactly. Yeah.
As we saw with Obama and Merkel a few years ago.
And the Five Eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is nothing new. But what I would say is that I think the world's been very late to wake up to the rise of Chinese imperialism. This is not some right-wing, mantra that I'm trotting out. It's a reality that China has switched its defense procurement away from purely or primarily defensive weapons procurement towards offensive long-range capacity, both in terms of naval power and air power and military armed power in terms of armoured regiments and so on. That is not the kind of procurement that a purely self-defensive nation does. And I think what China's been doing in the South China Sea with the Spratly Islands and other places is clearly bullying the Philippines, Vietnam, and other neighbouring nations to try and extend its sphere of influence and its economic zone where it can get fisheries and oil and gas from seabeds. This is classic imperialism, just like Britain in the 19th century or the United States in the 20th century. I say down all of them.
Well, I was with you up until the last bit. Tony?
One of my favourite books is actually called The Life and Death of a Chinese Joint Venture, because I lived in China 30 years ago. It's very simple. They will do a joint venture with you. You'll build a factory over here to manufacture X. They will build an identical factory down the valley and build X again. And they'll say your factory hasn't got a market anymore, and they will deny the entry of the other. This is true stories all over China. We just have to understand, respect them, but also see them for what they are. They, as Peter says, they are an imperialist nation.
I think we're moving on from the espionage aspect. If you go to Mozambique or Senegal or Sri Lanka, all around the world, St. Kitts and Nevis, you'll see Chinese building cultural centres, community centres, sports fields.
And using slave labour. And using
very
slave
often,
labour.
and I can't remember who wrote that book, Africa, China's Second Continent, but it's extremely, that's very, very worrying. And I think about the Spratlys and where they've actually created a completely artificial sphere of influence there. It's absolutely terrifying. But I think the espionage is almost a minor factor in this. I mean, for me, we've not mentioned the one word that actually sends a shiver down my spine, and that's Taiwan. I'm terrified as to what China might do. If you go, I've been to Taiwan a couple of times, and it's a beautiful country with marvellous people, and they are terrified about what they call the Straits issue.
Well, you say that. I have a friend who lives in Taiwan, and about a year ago, I think, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I texted him and I said, do you think that sort of this will encourage China to invade Taiwan? He said, they're not going to invade Taiwan. And he wasn't worried about it at all. But in the same way that a lot of Ukrainians weren't worried about it at all.
Well, I'm sorry. Tsai Ing-wen, there was the president, I knew her at LSE, we were at LSE together to mention this one. And when I, first time I actually went to Taipei, I was talking to some people there. They said, oh, no, because China won't do it. It's because they're Hong Kong. We're their offshore manufacturing base. It's very, very useful for them. Well, I'm sorry, look what happened to Hong Kong. Look what's happening to Hong Kong. Yeah. Macau is the only example I can think of where China's allowed anything outside the Central Communist Party.
But if anything, I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine might put them off, because what can happen is that you get bogged down and terrible things happen. It doesn't work out quite the way you plan.
An island's much easier to attack than an...
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
We're going to move on in just a moment. Peter Tatchell will be very interested in the next question because it mentions the words Canterbury of and Archbishop. It's 8:31 on LBC. Serena Farrow has the news headlines.
NATO members have been meeting in Brussels amid growing calls to supply Ukraine with more weapons and ammunition. Bosses say military aid for Kyiv must not falter. 2 police officers are facing misconduct hearings over reports of Wayne Couzens exposing himself. Couzens pleaded guilty to 3 counts of indecent exposure in the months prior to the murder of Sarah Everard. And 2 people have been arrested after allegedly sending malicious messages to council members over the disappearance of Nicola Bully. Lancashire police say they're a 49-year-old man from Manchester and a 20-year-old woman from Oldham. Miss Bully, a 45-year-old mum of 2, went missing 2.5 weeks ago whilst walking her dog. LBC weather staying pretty cold for much of the UK tonight. Rain in Northern Ireland and Western Scotland with a low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC.
I think we have a rather well-balanced panel on tonight's show. We have Peter Tatchell with us, Janet Daley from the Sunday Telegraph, Stephen Pound, former Labour MP, and Tony Devenish, Conservative London Assembly member. Let's go to our next question. It's a text question from Tom in Sevenoaks. The Archbishop of Canterbury claims he was twice summoned to Parliament by MPs who he says were trying to force the Church of England to introduce same-sex marriage. What will it take for this to finally happen? Peter?
Well, it's a bit much to suggest that the Archbishop was summoned to Parliament, because he is a member of Parliament. He's a member of the House of Lords.
And, of course, the Church of England was created by Parliament.
Exactly. It's the established church as well. It is the state religion. And certainly his claims that he was threatened by MPs are quite a distortion. I mean...
What did they threaten? I mean, what are they going to do to him?
All they said was... You know, if the church maintains discrimination, that was a major problem, given that the church is the state-endorsed religion and is out of step with the state's own policy of equality for everyone, including same-sex marriage. So you can't really have a state church that doesn't follow the policies of the state. And so there's an argument about disestablishment, or an argument about finding some kind of way around this. But the big misrepresentation is that no one is saying that the church should be forced to conduct same-sex marriages. All people are saying is that those individual clergy and congregations who want to conduct same-sex marriages should be allowed to do so, and those that don't want to, they should be free to decline them. So it's a very fair compromise, as we saw with women priests and bishops and a whole divorcees and so on. There's always been this compromise where the church has decided that those bishops and priests and congregations who want to do X, Y, and Z should be free to do so, but others should not be compelled. And that's all we're asking for.
Tony?
Oh dear, I always try and keep out of culture war stories, actually. I stick to crime, housing, environment and transport.
Well, just on this occasion,
I'm not a member of the C of E, really. I really haven't got an opinion. I'm actually a lapsed Catholic, so I'll keep away from the C of E.
No such thing.
Well, you must have a view as to whether churches should be able to conduct same-sex marriages, because at the moment they're not allowed to.
I really honestly don't have a view. I don't really think it's...
You represent a part of central London with quite a big gay population, probably, and you don't have a view on this?
I don't have a view either way is the honest answer. I'll probably get attacked for that on social media, but I'm not going to come on here and make up a view in 10 seconds, Ian.
It's part of the programme to give views. You know?
I'm really sorry, but Peter's probably got the better handle on this story.
Stephen Pound?
I don't agree with Peter. It's something I don't very often disagree, much to my personal amazement. But look, I think what you're guaranteeing there is the complete rupture. The thing about same-sex marriage is it exists, it's there, it's not a problem, but why do people who want to move on, from civil partnerships, where the majority of the population the majority of the people in this country don't want to get married in a mosque or a synagogue or a church or a gurdwara or a mandir. They want to get married in a register office. And it just seems extraordinary that this...
Well, where do you come up with that statistic?
Because the sheer number of church weddings, the number of church weddings within the C of E is now infinitesimal compared to the number of registry
not the number of Catholic weddings or Orthodox Jewish weddings.
Well, no, hang on a second. Don't forget, we can't. No, I mean, for a Catholic to get married, you have to actually then get licensed by the church. You can't, as we're not part of the established church. A Catholic cannot conduct a complete marriage ceremony within a Catholic church. We're the long-term victims here. But look, the reality is, if you're saying that the Church of England is, by biblical precept, banning this particular action, then quite clearly, who on earth who's a practicing Anglican would want to go against that?
Well, there are many Christians who are gay, and they would like to be married in their own church. And so I would have thought it was quite reasonable for them to do so, because it is the law of the land that equal marriage exists.
Yeah, and as indeed it does, and as it exists for everybody who wishes to get married in a register office. But I think that something which would create such an extraordinary schism within the church, which would actually benefit a very small number of the population, what, 10, 15% of the population? I don't know. But for that, as far as I'm concerned, the Archbishop of Canterbury has tied himself in knots over this. And I'm sure there must be Tories looking for the the Thomas à Becket solution here. But it's, I mean, but in
slightly drastic, but
well, I'm sorry, but but I mean, there's an element of who will rid me here. But look, I honestly, I just cannot understand how this has become a huge shibboleth, a great issue. If it's when we had the the big debate on
well, you can't
civil
understand it because you're not gay. I'm not nearly
good-looking enough to be
That's
gay.
very true.
I voted enthusiastically, for civil partnerships, enthusiastically, and my gay brothers actually supported me. This, real brothers, not just comrades. But at that time, I remember Chris Bryant saying, "This is not, of course, the first step, to church wedding. This is it. We don't want any more than that." And then it proceeds. So I think if we'd went down the Tatchell line of, say, some churches do, some churches don't, then I think inevitably there'd be a logic to it becoming maybe universal. And if that's the case, then you've got a real structural problem between the relationship with the church and the state. And I think for the first time in years, we'll start talking about anti-disestablishmentarianism.
But, we've already had this compromise that some churches can and some can't with regard to women priests or divorcees and so on. There's always been this compromise. It hasn't torn the church apart.
Women priests.
Janet Daley, the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury here, I think, is quite interesting because he hasn't shown any leadership at all, has he?
I mean, this is... if you forgive my saying so, I'm not Christian. I was raised by another outfit. I'm not Christian, so I can't. I don't feel it's appropriate for me to intervene in this.
Oh no, not you as
well. No. But I do have a view.
You're saying I've got no skin in the game either.
I do have an opinion, and that is that this is a typical Anglican mashup. The Anglican Church came out of compromise. It exists in compromise. It has compromised on virtually every single important issue, except when it was just devoutedly anti-Thatcherite. They didn't have much compromise on that. But now they have got, Peter, the idea of a blessing. Mm-hmm. And so you can have your civil marriage and you can then have a blessing in church. And that used to apply to divorced people as well. They could only get blessings, not wedding ceremonies. It's not essentially a homophobic thing. It's about theologically, which sort of people are eligible.
So why couldn't they move on?
Well, don't ask me. I mean, Anglican, because it's an established church, which is an anomaly in the modern world. It has to accommodate political solutions as well as what it regards as theological truth, if indeed it assumes anything is theological truth now. And it tends always to sacrifice the theological truth for the political, pragmatic reality.
Expediency.
Yes, and I don't think that's a healthy situation. I actually think disestablishment would be a better solution, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Anglican Church, I mean, it's already split between high church and low church, evangelical and, so the disestablishment would probably reinvigorate the Anglican faith, if anything.
And what's the situation? I think you're of the Jewish faith, am I right? What's the situation on gay people getting married in the Jewish faith?
Well, Orthodox Jews regard homosexuality as absolutely anathema. And, I mean, my great friend, Rabbi Hugo Gryn, fell out with the chief rabbi over this because he was very sympathetic to gays, not necessarily to gay marriage, but to gay participation in the religion. And this has been a very serious split. But the chief rabbi, who may not be aware of this, the chief rabbi is only head of the Orthodox Jewish religion, not the rest, the Reform and the Progressive. So there is a lot of going your own way within the Jewish faith.
Who'd be religious, eh?
Yeah.
Can I just say that, the Church of England recently apologised to the LGBT plus community for the pain and suffering they'd caused over the decades and centuries. That was great. But then they reiterated discrimination by banning same-sex marriage. That is not consistent. It doesn't make sense. And then, of course, they said, well, we'll offer you blessings instead. Well, blessings is what the church gives to dogs and guinea pigs.
Oh, come on.
And to tanks and warships.
Come on.
We are not the equivalent. To downgrade LGBT plus people to that kind of status is really profoundly offensive. And I know from very loyal Anglicans who are friends of mine, they are so distressed. And they're not even gay. They feel this is just so shocking. And just now, the Archbishop of Canterbury has been in West Africa whining and dining with all these homophobic Anglican leaders who want to put gay people in prison. He's been seeking to appease and placate them.
That's another problem for the Anglican Church, is that most Anglicans in the world now are in Africa.
Yeah.
And
which is why a split is inevitable, actually, I think.
Exactly.
Go back to Jesus didn't go into the temple and sort of placate the religious leaders. He turned over the table.
And this is what I always say in this.
Moneylenders.
What would Jesus do? If
money
Jesus
changers.
were alive today, and I have no doubt that Jesus existed, I'm not religious, but I do believe Jesus existed, what would he think today? And this is why we need a New Testament. I think that's the solution to this. Actually, update
drastic.
it all. Well, it is drastic, but after 2,000 years, why the hell not? 8:40.
I'm not sure why the hell is the appropriate
Theological
expression.
truths are eternal. You don't get it.
It is 8:46.
Why the heaven?
This is LBC.
Peter Tatchell, Janet Daley, Stephen Pound and Tony Devenish with me answering your questions. Adam in Westminster has the next one. Adam, hello.
Hi, good evening, Ian, and good evening to the panel. What I would like to know is, what would a second Donald Trump presidency mean for the world?
Oh, God.
Tony Devenish, there's no getting out of this one.
No, well, I've got an answer for this. Yeah,
Good.
we all know
God
that,
for that.
we all know that Donald Trump's ego means he's going to stand as president whether the Republicans give him the nomination or not. I think he will lose whether he gets the Republican nomination or whether he's an independent candidate. You know, I'm not ecstatic about Biden, a second term of Biden. I think Biden is an appalling president, but he's slightly better, or quite a lot better than Trump.
But Biden's doing surprisingly well at the moment. I must admit, I was horrified to see a headline in the Wall Street Journal, was it last week, that said $3 trillion boost for the IRA. And I thought, hello? What's going on here? But it's because it's the Inflation Reduction Act, which is apparently is proving to be extremely effective. And if you look at AstraZeneca, a lot of people are actually moving across to America. And I think we should actually be quite frightened about that. As for Biden standing next time, well, obviously not. But the question is, they can't dump Kamala Harris.
No.
They just can't, because
Why?
that would it would offend women.
She's utterly useless.
Yeah, I'm not sure it would offend women.
I'm not going to try to, die on a dinner
Well,
ditch.
they can't ditch her because she's black and female.
Because exactly that particular...
And the coalition of the left Democrats right here. So.
I do love the idea of the coalition of the left out there. I've been trying to find it for 50
But the
years.
Democrats think she's useless as well.
Yeah.
I know, but they also think that Joe Biden is too old. But, they're trapped. Absolutely trapped. Wait, cometh the hour, cometh
Anyway,
Elizabeth Warren.
Oh, God.
Said no one ever.
Please.
I noticed you haven't actually mentioned the word Trump in your answer.
No, I used to be a politician. No, it's because the thought is just too horrendous. I mean, it's too horrible for words. It's too and I see Jared and Ivanka are actually supporting Nikki Haley.
Really?
Yes, there's a picture of the three of them with their arms around each other, and they actually made a contribution to...
Janet Daley.
Well, I think Trump is a nightmare. I mean, literally a nightmare. I have seen, I think, every presidential inaugural since John Kennedy, when I was a preternaturally political schoolgirl, and I have never seen a president-elect arrive on the Capitol shaking his fist in the air like a tin pot dictator. It was like watching the rise of Mussolini.
I want to hug you now, because I was in Washington for that, commentated, doing my programme from there. And at the end of his speech, I thought, I don't know what I'm going to say now. And I said, that was a speech that Mussolini could have given.
Absolutely.
I mean, not necessarily the content.
No, the mannerisms, the strutting. Yeah, I was just... Well, anyway, enough of that. It's going to be... I'm sure it's going to be DeSantis, but when I put, to a major ex-Trump White House figure a few weeks ago, the idea of DeSantis and Nikki Haley as a dream ticket... He rejected that idea. An awful lot of people in the Republican hierarchy don't seem to like Nikki Haley. They're very keen on DeSantis.
Why?
I don't know exactly. I think it's a personal thing. And she was, of course, loyal to Trump to the end, at least ostensibly. I think, if anything, she's a plausible vice presidential candidate. And I don't know how DeSantis would feel about that, but he's definitely the hope for the future. The Democrats are really screwed. I can't see how they can get out of this trap. They cannot possibly let Biden run again, and they can't take Kamala Harris. I mean, there was a rumor at one point that Kamala Harris would be offered a seat on the Supreme Court to get her out of the way. That didn't happen, so she's clearly going to be there for the next election. She would have to find some excuse to recuse herself.
They can't have Nikki as a VP. They can't have Florida and Carolina on the ticket. It's got to be somebody.
That's true.
There's no way geographically.
Yeah, that's true.
It's the Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy argument.
Yeah.
Peter Tatchell.
I think it is almost inconceivable that Boris Trump will be president.
Boris
Trump. Yeah. There's a Freudian slip in there, everyone.
Like you didn't mean it.
I think that there is a hardcore of support, but I think that clearly Republican sentiment is moving towards other candidates. Ron DeSantis is a very, very dangerous man. I mean,
is he?
Well, he's extremely homophobic. He's banned on any discussion about LGBT issues in schools. He's proposing that all children in schools should be required to prove they're menstruating if they claim to be women. Well, this is a proposal. It hasn't been enacted, but this is a proposal that he has toyed with. An incredibly humiliating thing, not just for trans women, but for all women to have to subject themselves to menstrual tests.
I can't see that.
In terms of the Democrats, I agree that Biden hasn't been as bad as I thought he would, but nor has he been as good as he could have been. I'm a bit like you. I do think that the ideal ticket would be Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren.
If you want to lose it, you're right.
If you want Trump to be president,
but Bernie's a bit young.
But that will only work if the Democrats start doing more grassroots organising, like the Labour Party here and the other parties here. The Democrats are very top-down. And we see in some instances where there's been grassroots organising and they've made gains.
I want to fit in one more question, and that's a text question from Jerry in Birmingham. He says, NATO leaders still haven't agreed to send fighter jets to Ukraine. Do the panel think this will eventually happen, and should it? Now, if you can keep your answers relatively brief on this, I'd be grateful. Stephen Pound.
It will happen, but it will not be effective because it takes at least 9 months to actually train.
3.
I'm sorry, if you actually look at the full training schedule.
No, I had an Air Vice Marshal sit sit in your seat last week telling me that if he was training me, it would take 3 years, but if he was training somebody who already knew how to fly a plane, it would take 3 months.
Okay, I'm surprised to hear that. That's one view, and there's another view out there. But I also think that we would pretty much be denuding our own air defences when we've only got 15 jet fighter pilots apparently on active service in the country today.
Tony?
Well, I agree with that answer. There isn't actually that many jet pilots in any of the air forces in the world. Unless you're going to put up RAF or German or French pilots out there with the aircraft, it will happen.
Which you're not.
Exactly, so it's going to take quite a long time.
Peter?
The struggle in Ukraine is between democracy and Putin's fascism. This is an anti-imperialist struggle like against Nazism during World War II. It's different, but it's very similar. And, Russia is doing to Ukraine today what the Nazis did in the 1940s. We have to stand with Ukraine. Already, there are moves among people in Russia who want to extend. They want to go into Moldova. There's a conspiracy, a plot to overthrow the democratic government in Moldova, to bring it back into the Russian sphere of influence. There's talk about similar interventions in the Baltic states.
And in Georgia, Armenia.
Yeah, exactly. If we allow Putin to get away with this, other nations will fall. This is a great historic struggle, and I would urge all MPs or any MPs listening to support Clive Lewis's EDM, which is arguing that there's huge amounts of surplus armaments that we are now about to dispose of. Armoured cars, helicopters, all kinds of weapons that are surplus to our requirements. They're out of date for us, but would definitely help Ukraine. Okay. And we should be gifting those to Ukraine rather than just dispose of them on the open market.
Janet?
This isn't the war we thought we were going to have with Russia. This is an old-fashioned, down-and-dirty imperial war, and it's more like the First World War, actually, than the Second. But the one parallel that it does have with Hitler is that he's making exactly the same sort of argument about the Russian separatists that Hitler made in the Sudetenland. These are all German-speaking people. We rightfully own them. There was a plausible argument for this over Crimea, because Crimea is a big deal in Russian history. Anybody who's read War and Peace, read Tolstoy. Crimea has been tremendously important to Russia, and that's probably why the West let him get away with that. But when he now talks about taking on the whole Donbass, taking on the whole of eastern Ukraine, presumably taking over the whole of Ukraine eventually, the entire logic of his position evaporates, because if he were to take the whole of Ukraine, he would have two solid NATO states on his border. Poland and Hungary. So how does that work? The idea that he's being threatened by an expansionist NATO and that's what he's terrified of, he wants to take his Russian empire, his medieval Russian empire, right to the door of NATO.
I don't know who the sketch writer was who talked about his brilliant speech in Westminster Hall last week when Rishi Sunak was delighted to actually find a world leader shorter than him on the way.
Yes.
But when somebody said, when he was going on about British tea, and he said, from typhoon to typhoons in one speech, the man's a genius.
Indeed. Right, final question from Marianne in Purley. She says, how wonderful of your panel to spend their Valentine's Day with you, Iain. Not the whole day. If they were having a romantic evening, what or who would their ideal date be? Stephen.
Oh, God.
Well, you're obviously an old romantic, bringing these chocolates in for me.
I did bring my wife some roses this evening.
From Esso.
I forget the name of the petrol station, but I also bought her a road map and some new windscreen wipers.
A road map?
Okay.
Who uses a road map?
What's your ideal date?
The ideal date would be with somebody I don't even know, because it would just be one of those marvellous serendipitous closing doors occasions where you just bump into somebody.
I do hope your wife isn't listening. Tony?
Well, I had steak and chips with my wife at 6 o'clock.
I hope that's a euphemism.
We often eat early because I'm often out at constituency events in the evening rather than being a glamorous studio with you, Iain.
You old romantic. Peter?
My ideal date would be with my partner at the foot of the Angel Falls in Venezuela, the highest waterfall in the world, almost 1 kilometre from top to bottom.
Wow.
It's an 8-hour trek to get there from the nearest sort of village. I'd be quite up for it, but I think my partner, he'd sort of recuse himself from that big long trek through the jungle.
So would I. Janet?
Well, it would have to be my husband, of course.
Of course.
And I'm not even spending the evening with him. I'm here.
Iain, can we hear who yours would be? Are we allowed to do this?
Probably. Who can? Well, obviously my husband. But if he were unavailable,
let us posit that.
Let us posit that. Any member of the West Ham football team.
I knew where you were going. I knew it. I absolutely.
But I won't pick out one in particular. Thank you very much indeed to all of you, to Tony, to Stephen, to Janet, and to Peter. I'm seeing Peter again on Thursday because we're going to be recording a very long interview for my All Talk podcast. Coming up in the next hour, we are going to talk about memory loss, because former Top Gear host Richard Hammond has said he fears his worsening memory could be linked to that terrible crash he underwent in 2006 when he suffered serious head injuries. He's told the Chief Executive, Diary of a Chief Executive podcast that his working memory was good, but he worries about his long-term memory. Have you got worried about memory loss? If so, what did you do about it? Because Richard Hammond has not been to have any tests, despite the fact that he realises he has a problem. Have you been in that position before? And what happened? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, NATO members have been meeting in Brussels amid growing calls to supply Ukraine with more weapons and ammunition. Bosses say military aid for Kyiv must not falter. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace arrived today for the first meeting of the year. But retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell says it'll take the West years to replenish the ammunition already given to Ukraine.
America has donated over 1 million rounds of the artillery since the start of the conflict. But the challenge is that the production that its industry can provide is less than 1/10 of that. So it will take some years for it to recoup. And even if it surges, that industry, we're still looking for several years before it can recover.
US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin says he's nothing to say on supplying Kyiv with fighter jets either. Sadiq Khan is being asked to rethink plans to expand London's ultra-low emission zone by 4 Labour MPs. The city's mayor wants a daily charge on the most polluting vehicles to include every one of the capital's borough by the end of August. Transport for London says the mayor is trying to tackle air pollution in the city. Well, UK leader for the International Clean Cities campaign, Oliver Lord, told LBC it couldn't come at a better time, though.
I honestly don't think this is enough time to do it. After 2 years of a worldwide pandemic where we actually started to appreciate how valuable our lungs are, this is absolutely the right time to be cleaning up the air so that we actually, prevent that sort of illness in the future.
2 people have been arrested after allegedly sending malicious messages to council members over the disappearance of Nicola Bulley. Lancashire police say there's a 49-year-old man from Manchester and a 20-year-old woman from Oldham. Ms Bulley, a 45-year-old mum of 2, went missing 2.5 weeks ago whilst walking her dog. And organisers of next year's Summer Olympics say they've received assurances that recommendations from a new UEFA report will be implemented at venues in time for the Games in Paris. A review into the poor treatment of Liverpool fans outside last year's Champions League final at the Stade de France found failings almost led to a disaster. LBC markets report the FTSE 100 closed up 6 points at 79.53. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.13. LBC weather chilly for much of the UK tonight with a low of 2. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Serena Farrow.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
4 minutes past 9 is the time on LBC. Stephen Pound just when I'd finished doing that talk-up about memory loss, he said one of the things that he fears most is dementia, and I can completely relate to that. I'm at the age of 60. I know that there are many people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia, sometimes now in the late 30s, 40s, 50s, early onset Alzheimer's it's called. And I won't say that I've obsessed about it, but it's the one thing in life that I suppose I fear. My mother was exactly the same, and she would always say to the three of us, sort of, if I ever get that, I don't want to live. And I remember